Right now, as you listen to this, you are lying still. The room around you is dark. Above you, a ceiling you have probably seen so many times you no longer really see it at all. Hold that image for a moment. Researchers across 3 continents asked what would happen to a human being given one ceiling, exactly that, for 180 days. Half a year, 2 whole seasons that would come and go on the other side of a sealed door. They built habitats the size of a modest 2-bedroom apartment, 1,300 square feet. They sealed the doors on a Hawaiian volcano, in Antarctic stations where the temperature outside fell to -51 degrees Celsius, in facilities designed to be as close to Mars as anything on Earth. Across one simulation alone, scientists collected 4.396 million minutes of continuous behavioral data. Every movement, every sleep cycle, every hour a person spent in artificial light. Sit with that for a moment. More than 4 million minutes. A single stretch of life measured out in the smallest possible pieces, so that later, no change would be too small to notice. What they found was not emotional collapse, not the kind of breakdown most people imagine when they hear the word isolation. Here is what most people get wrong. The damage is not something you feel and eventually heal when the door opens and the sun comes back. It is not loneliness. It is not fear. It is not the slow, accumulating weight of a room that never changes. The damage is structural, measured in cubic millimeters of tissue. Visible on a brain scan. Given enough of one ceiling, the human brain begins to reshape itself. Grey matter thins in regions responsible for memory, for attention, for the way you orient yourself in space. And one region, just one, was still measurably smaller in participants 5 months after they had returned to ordinary life. That region has a name, and tonight, across 8 movements, you will come to understand exactly what it does, why it did not recover, and what the scientists who found it believe it means. If the sound of a slow voice moving through the dark is the kind of thing that helps you let go at the end of a long day, you can follow gravity of sleep, and there will always be another night like this one, waiting for you. That is the only thing I will ask of you, and you do not even have to do it now. Take a slow breath. Find a position your body can soften into. There is nothing here you need to hold. Let's begin. Start with something simple to say and strange to sit with. Everything you are about to hear came from a small number of people who agreed to be sealed away and studied for months at a time. Not prisoners, not castaways, volunteers. Scientists, doctors, engineers, chosen with great care, screened for steadiness, placed inside rooms built to keep them still, while the rest of the world went on turning without them. And in nearly every one of these sealed places, in the deep cold of Antarctica, on the high slope of a Hawaiian volcano, in a windowless facility on the edge of Moscow, the same quiet pattern rose to the surface. The mind did not shatter. It did not go mad in the way the old stories promise. Instead, slowly, almost politely, it began to change its shape. Not all at once, not in a way anyone inside could see from one day to the next, but measurably, region by region, in tissue you could weigh. But before we can weigh a single gram of that changed tissue, before we can name the folds that grew quiet and the folds that grew thin, you have to understand where any of this was ever seen. A mind does not reveal these things in a clinic you can visit on a weekday afternoon. It reveals them only after it has been held apart from the world for a very long time. And the whole difficult history of what we know is really the history of a small handful of sealed places. Not many of them. You could count them on your fingers, each one built a little larger than the last in its ambition, each one holding a person still for a little longer, each one reaching a little further from the ordinary warmth of other people. And the strange thing, the thing worth resting on before we go any further, is that the first of these places was not a spacecraft, and not a laboratory. It was the coldest, emptiest edge of our own planet. Go back to Antarctica. Not the Antarctica of the photographs, the blue ice and the low gold light. Think instead of a single building, sealed against a night that lasts for months, with nothing living for hundreds of miles in any direction. In 2019, a researcher named Alexander Stahn, working across two great institutions, one in Berlin and one in Pennsylvania, published a study of 9 people who had wintered at a station called Neumayer, the third station to carry that name. 5 men, 4 women, 9 ordinary human beings who had agreed to spend 14 months at the bottom of the world, and of those 14 months, 9 of them in complete isolation. No flights in, no flights out. The temperature outside falling to 50 degrees below zero on the Celsius scale. Let that number settle for a moment. 50 below. Cold enough that the air itself becomes a kind of wall. Cold enough that the outside world stops being a place you could walk into and becomes simply the reason the door stays shut. And what Stahn and his colleagues found inside those 9 people was quiet and specific and a little frightening in how ordinary it sounds. Not madness, not breakdown, a small structure deep in the brain, a curl of tissue called the dentate gyrus, a piece of the hippocampus that the brain uses to lay down new memories and to know where the body is in space, had measurably grown smaller in the expedition members than in the people who had stayed behind. And a certain protein, the one the brain leans on to grow and to keep its nerve cells alive, had begun to fall within the first 3 months, and had still not climbed back to where it started, even a month and a half after everyone came home. That is the detail I want you to carry gently into the dark with you. The isolation ended, and the effect did not. The body walked back out into the world, and some part of the brain stayed behind in the cold a little longer. Now that was one station, one winter, 9 people. Hold that as your first rung, and feel how small it is, because the next place makes it feel almost gentle. Deeper into the same continent, higher on the polar plateau, there is a station named Concordia, and Concordia is colder still. Its average temperature, across a whole year, sits at 51 degrees below zero. Not its worst day, its ordinary day. And on its worst days the reading has fallen to 85 degrees below zero, which is a cold so complete that it belongs less to weather than to physics. You do not need to remember any of these numbers. Let them pass through you. They are only here to show you how far from everything these places sit. At certain points in the deep winter, it is easier to reach the crew of a spacecraft in orbit than to reach the people inside Concordia. 2 different researchers went looking, in 2 different ways, at what that place does to a person. One of them, Nathan Smith, working out of Manchester with the support of the European Space Agency, watched crews across 2 separate Antarctic winters, and we will come back to what he saw, because what he saw is one of the strangest and most important ideas in this whole long night. The other, more recently, in 2025, a researcher named David Rolfe followed a larger group, 25 crew members in all, 20 men and 5 women, with an average age of about 37, each of them spending close to a full year sealed inside. And Rolfe did something the earlier work could only hint at. He placed their brains inside a scanner before they left, and again after they returned, and he measured, region by region, what a year in that place had taken. We will open that measurement slowly and carefully later, because it is the heart of tonight. For now, hold only this. It was not one small structure this time. It was many. And when the grey matter of the brain grew smaller, the hollow spaces inside the skull, the fluid-filled chambers that sit near the centre of the brain, grew larger to fill the room that was left behind. The brain did not simply lose a little of itself. It quietly rearranged the space it lived in. So that is the cold end of this story, the 2 Antarctic stations, and already you can feel the ground shifting under the word isolation. It is not merely being alone. It is being sealed, for seasons at a time, inside a place the rest of the world cannot easily reach. But the researchers who study this were never only asking about Antarctica. Antarctica was the closest thing they had to somewhere else. What they were really circling was space, and a journey no one has taken yet. A journey to Mars that would keep a small crew sealed together for the better part of 2 years. And you cannot send people to Mars to find out what it does to them, so instead they built the journey on the ground. On the edge of Moscow, inside a plain facility with no windows to the outside world, engineers assembled a set of sealed modules, and into them they placed 6 healthy men, 3 from Russia, 2 from Europe, 1 from China, with an average age of just 32. The doors closed on the 3rd of June, 2010, and they did not open again until the 4th of November, 2011. 520 days, a year and a half and then some, spent entirely inside, with the outside world thinned down to messages and to a slow, deliberate pretense that they were somewhere unimaginably far away. They were asked to imagine the distance. They lived on the calendar of a mission that existed only in the mind, a voyage out to Mars, a stay, and the long voyage home, all of it performed inside a building you could have driven past without a second glance. And here is why anyone was willing to give more than a year of 6 men's lives to a pretended voyage. There was no other way to know. You cannot simply ask a mind what a long confinement does to it, because the mind that comes out is not quite the same mind that went in, and it cannot always tell you what changed. So instead they watched, patiently, relentlessly, the way you would watch something far too slow to see. On the wrist of each crew member they fastened a small monitor, and across those 520 days it recorded, minute by minute, whether the man wearing it was moving or still, awake or asleep. When it was finished, that quiet little instrument had gathered more than 4 million separate minutes of data, 4.396 million minutes to be exact, covering 98 out of every 100 minutes of the entire mission. Almost nothing was missed. Almost every heartbeat of stillness and of motion across a year and a half, written down and kept. Sit with that for a moment, softly, because it tells you something about how closely all of this was watched. Not a diary, not a handful of interviews after the fact. A minute-by-minute ledger of 6 human bodies, held for 520 days, built precisely so that no slow drift, no gradual sinking, no small daily surrender of energy could hide itself inside the tidy story a person tells about their own ordinary day. And here is the strange thing about that mission, the thing worth holding on to as you lie there in the dark. Those 6 men were never truly in danger. Mars 500 was not a voyage, it was a rehearsal, a sealed building, sitting quietly in Moscow, on solid ground, under an ordinary sky. Their average age was 32. 3 of them came from Russia, 2 from Europe, 1 from China. They walked in on the 3rd of June, 2010, and they did not walk back out until the 4th of November, 2011. 520 days behind a door that, in the end, could always have been opened. No vacuum on the other side of the wall, no cold that would kill you. If something had gone truly wrong, the door would have opened, and the world would have been standing right there, waiting for them. And still, even inside that safety, even knowing that rescue was only ever a handle away, their bodies began the slow surrender that those wrist monitors recorded, minute after patient minute. That is the first rung of all of this. The gentlest version, the one with a way out. Hold it in mind, softly, because everything that comes after this only takes the way out away. Move up a single step, and the way out grows longer. On the side of a volcano in Hawaii, on the high flank of Mauna Loa, at 8,200 feet above the sea, a small dome was built and quietly called Mars. Inside it, 1,300 square feet. Picture that for a moment. A modest 2-bedroom apartment, and not one window looking out onto anything alive. 6 people at a time, from several countries, men and women together, sealed within it. 3 separate crews passed through, 18 people in all, some for 8 months, one crew for a full 12. And here they folded in a cruelty that the Moscow building never had. Every message these crews sent to the outside was held, on purpose, for 20 minutes before it could arrive, and every reply held for 20 minutes coming back. A simple question and its answer, 40 minutes apart. You could not have a conversation. You could only send words out into a delay and wait. When the scientists, led by Jocelyn Dunn Rosenberg of Purdue University, finally published what they had learned, in December of 2022, they described the mind drifting through phases, the way weather drifts through a season. Let that thought rest lightly for now. We will return to those phases later. For the moment, only notice the shape of the climb, a rehearsal you could walk out of, and then a rehearsal with a wall of silence built into every single word. Now take the rehearsal away completely. Travel to Antarctica, to a station named Neumayer, the third to carry that name, standing on a shelf of ice inside a darkness that lasts for months at a time. Here there is no simulated delay, because here the distance is entirely real. In the deep of the Antarctic winter, no aircraft can reach you. If your appendix bursts, if your heart stops, if you simply cannot bear one more hour of the sameness, there is no door that opens onto a waiting world. There is only more ice and more cold, cold that falls to 50 degrees below zero. In 2019, a physician named Alexander Stahn, working across Berlin and Pennsylvania, published in the New England Journal of Medicine what he had measured in 9 people who had wintered there. 5 men, 4 women, 14 months on the ice, 9 of those months spent in true isolation. And when he compared their brains before and after, a small structure buried deep inside the head, a delicate fold of the hippocampus that helps you find your way and hold a memory in place, had grown measurably smaller. Not tired, not stressed in some vague way you could shake off with one good night of sleep. Physically smaller, and the protein that keeps nerve cells alive and growing had begun falling inside the first 3 months, and had still not climbed back to where it started, weeks after they had already come home. And even that, as it turns out, was not the coldest chamber, nor the longest. Deeper into the continent, higher on the ice, sits a station named Concordia, where the temperature across an average year settles near 51 degrees below zero, and where the lowest reading ever taken there fell to 85 below. That is a cold the human body simply has no answer for. To stand outside in it, unprotected, is not to be alive for very long. Inside, a psychologist named Nathan Smith of the University of Manchester watched 2 full winters pass and saw something he had not expected to find. Not people fighting harder as the dark pressed in around them. The opposite of that. And in 2025, a second team, led by David Rolfe, scanned 25 people who had spent close to a year at that station, an average age of around 37, and found not one small fold, but many regions of the brain grown smaller, and the hollow spaces inside the skull grown wider, quietly opening to fill the room the shrinking had left behind. Sit with that gently. You do not need to do anything with it. You do not need to remember it in the morning. Only let it be true for a moment, and then let it pass through you, and let your shoulders soften as it goes. The organ that is listening to this voice, right now, can, under the right amount of silence and cold and time, quietly give up some part of itself, and then, the final step, the one that leaves the ground behind entirely. Everything so far has happened on this planet. A building in Moscow, a dome in Hawaii, 2 stations on the Antarctic ice. All of it real, all of it hard, and all of it still resting on solid earth, beneath a sky you could, in principle, still reach up toward. Now take the earth itself away, far above your head, moving faster than any thought you have ever had. There is a small metal room where human beings have lived for stretches of 6 months at a time, with nothing but a thin wall between their skin, and a cold, and a vacuum that makes even Antarctica look kind. In 2024, a team at NASA, led by Sheena Dev and Suzanne Bell, tested 25 astronauts across those 6-month stays and found their attention slowing, their working memory slowing, and some of that slowness still present after they were safely back on the ground. And one man went further than 6 months. Scott Kelly spent 340 days inside that orbiting room, while his identical twin brother Mark stayed here, on the Earth, serving as a living measure of the difference between them. When Scott finally came home, a researcher named Matthias Basner tested him on 10 separate measures of the thinking mind, and found him slower and less accurate on very nearly all of them, and found that the slowness lingered for a full 6 months after his feet had touched the ground again. And here is the truth that ought, by rights, to keep you awake, except that tonight it is going to do the opposite, and help carry you down into sleep instead. In every one of these places, in the building and the dome, and the 2 stations on the ice, and the little room in orbit, the thing that shrank the brain, and slowed the mind, and pulled the will to cope so quietly downward, was never the cold, and never the vacuum, and never the sheer distance from home. It was only ever the walls, and the sameness, and the missing faces, and the vast, shapeless weight of time with nowhere left to go. The cosmos did none of this. The isolation did all of it, which means that the thing being measured in each of those sealed rooms is not really an astronaut's problem, or an explorer's problem, but a plain and ordinary human one, waiting patiently inside any life at all that goes quiet enough, for long enough. So the question worth resting on tonight is not whether the mind changes inside a sealed room. You already know that it does. The question is how, by what quiet machinery. Because whatever slowly undoes a person across half a year of confinement is not a single blow you could ever point to and name. It is a chemistry. A slow, patient chemistry, running underneath everything, made of the same signals your own brain is passing back and forth in the dark right now, as you lie here and listen. To watch that chemistry unfold, minute by minute, month by month, you would need to seal a small group of people away and measure them the entire time. And that is very nearly what a team did. On the side of a volcano in Hawaii, the habitat was a dome, about 1,300 square feet of floor, which is to say the size of a modest 2-bedroom apartment, with no windows onto anything real. It sat on the flank of Mauna Loa, high up, near 8,200 feet, on old lava the color of ash, chosen because it looks a little like Mars. 6 people at a time lived inside. Every message they sent to the outside world was delayed by 20 minutes, and every reply came 20 minutes late in return, exactly as it would across the Gulf to another planet. 3 separate crews did this, 18 people in all for 8 months, and once for a full 12. The study that came out of it, led by a researcher named Jocelyn Dunn Rosenberg at Purdue University, and published in the winter of 2022, did something simple and quietly devastating. It laid the whole experience out along a line, and found that it did not fall apart all at once. It fell apart in 4 movements, and each one had its own chemistry. The first movement is almost pleasant. She named it a kind of good stress. In the opening weeks, the body is flooded with the chemistry of novelty, of a mission just begun, of a hard thing being done well. The crew is sharp, the goals feel reachable. Everyone is, in a sense, at their best. If you had checked on them then, you would have found people thriving. This is the cruelty hidden in the shape of it. The beginning gives no warning at all. Then comes the second movement, and here the machinery begins to turn. Somewhere in the 3rd and 4th months, 2 chemicals inside those crew members started, measurably, to fall. The researchers were collecting samples on a schedule, tracking what the body was quietly doing, and what they saw was dopamine sliding downward, and serotonin sliding with it. It is worth slowing down on what those 2 words actually mean, because they are not abstractions, they are you. Dopamine is a great part of how you want things, how a plan comes to feel worth making, how the next small thing on the horizon manages to pull you toward it. Serotonin threads through your mood, your sleep, the steadiness of your sense that things are, on the whole, all right. When these two begin to ebb, nothing dramatic happens on the outside. There is no collapse. There is only a flattening. The food tastes like less. The joke lands smaller. The thing you were looking forward to arrives and feels, somehow, like nothing much. Not sadness exactly, not grief, just the slow draining of colour out of ordinary hours, so gradual that the person living it can rarely name the day it began. You may know a version of this feeling yourself, from some long grey stretch of your own life, and if you do, let that be a small comfort tonight rather than a weight. What was happening to those 6 people on the volcano was not madness. It was the same dimming any human chemistry drifts toward when the days stop bringing anything new. You are allowed to let that thought settle. You do not need to hold on to it. By the 5th and 6th months, something else showed up in the measurements, deeper than mood. The researchers found that oxidative damage, a kind of slow wear at the level of the cells themselves, rose to its highest point in exactly this window, and it climbed alongside another number that had been quietly falling the whole time. The crews were moving less. Their bodies had begun, without any decision being made, to conserve themselves. Around the 6th and 7th months, the physical activity dropped off sharply, at the very moment the cellular wear was peaking, as though the less they moved, the more the body frayed, and the more it frayed, the less it wished to move. That spiral, that quiet downward turning, is the thing to understand tonight, because it is the true engine underneath all of it. And there is a second confinement that captured it in almost unbearable detail. Not on a volcano this time, but in a windowless facility in Moscow, where 6 men were sealed inside a mock spacecraft for 520 days, a little over 17 months, to rehearse a journey to Mars and back. For nearly every minute of it, they wore sensors on their wrists. When it was over, the researchers had gathered the equivalent of more than 8 years of minute-by-minute recording, drawn from just 6 people, covering 98% of the entire mission. Almost nothing about how those men moved and slept and rested went unseen. And what the wrists revealed was the same spiral, written in numbers. Across the mission, the men's active wakeful time fell by about 7%. 7% sounds like nothing at all. It is the kind of figure you would let slide right past you. But translate it, hold it in a shape your body understands, and it becomes something else. 7% of a day is a little over an hour. It means that by the end, each man was generating roughly 1 hour and 7 minutes less waking alertness than he had at the start. More than an hour of a person, every single day, simply no longer switched on. And the time did not vanish. It flowed into rest. Their resting hours rose by about half an hour a day. Their sleep stretched a little longer too. Minute by minute, month by month, the crew was sinking deeper into stillness. Then there is the strangest thread of all, and the most self-reinforcing. Across those same 17 months, the amount of light falling on the crew fell by roughly a quarter. In the first stretch of the mission they lived under something like 105 lux, and by the final stretch that had dropped to about 78. To feel how dim that already was, hold it against the world outside your walls. An ordinary bright day pours tens of thousands of lux across your skin, whether you notice it or not. These men, rehearsing a voyage to another planet, were living their whole lives in something closer to the glow of a single lamp in a quiet room. And as they moved less, they drifted less often past the lights of the habitat, and so they caught even less of that already thin illumination. And the less light they caught, the more their inner clocks loosened, and the looser the clock, the harder it became to move with any purpose at all. Less motion made less light. Less light made less motion. The loop tightened on itself, month after month, with no one inside it choosing a single turn of the screw. You can almost feel the shape of it from where you are lying. Think of a day you once spent entirely indoors. One grey, unbroken day when you never quite got up and moving. And how by evening your body felt heavier than it had any right to. Your thoughts a half step slower. Your appetite for anything at all worn thin. Now imagine that day repeated, without a single break in it, for the better part of a year. That is not a breakdown. It is only the ordinary weight of stillness, allowed to gather past the point any body was ever meant to carry it. This is the core of the mechanism, and it is worth naming plainly, softly, before you drift any further down. What isolation does to a mind is not a wound, it is a settling, a body reading its own long confinement as a signal to spend less, want less, burn less, until wanting itself grows faint. And the brain does not merely feel this. It is built out of the same falling chemistry as everything else. In another of these frozen studies, at a German station on the Antarctic ice, researchers watched a particular protein in the blood, one with a long name, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which does something beautifully simple. It is a kind of fertilizer for nerve cells. It helps the brain grow new connections and keeps the ones it already has alive. Within just 3 months of isolation, that protein had fallen. The very substance that tends the brain, that keeps it supple and repairing itself, had begun to run low before the crew was even halfway through. Sit with that for a moment, gently, the way you might hold a smooth stone in your palm before setting it down. The chemistry that flattens your mood, and the chemistry that quiets your body, and the chemistry that keeps the brain itself in good repair, are not 3 separate stories. They are one slow tide, and it goes out together. Somewhere around the middle of these long confinements, a person is left a little dimmer, a little stiller, a little less fed at the roots, without ever having felt a single thing break. And none of this, you understand, is the collapse most people picture when they imagine a mind left alone. It is far quieter than that, and far more ordinary. It is the sound of a system doing exactly what it was built to do, turning itself down to survive a length of time it cannot change. But there is a place, further along this line, where the quiet turning stops being merely a dimming, and takes on a harder edge. There is a point, somewhere past the halfway mark, where the pieces of a sealed world begin to come apart from one another. There is a name for what that tide is doing, and it belongs to a researcher named Nathan Smith, who worked out of the University of Manchester and spent 2 full winters watching the crews at Concordia Station, that same outpost sunk into the same Antarctic dark, where the average temperature settles near -51 degrees Celsius, and once on a recorded night fell all the way to -85. Smith went in expecting to find a mind that fought. He expected that as the months wore on and the sun stayed below the horizon, the people inside would reach harder for the things that hold a person together. They would lean on each other more. They would keep their small routines more deliberately. They would push back against the pressure. That is what we imagine a mind under strain is supposed to do. It is supposed to rally. That is not what the winter showed him. What he found instead was that every strategy the crew used to cope, the active ones and the quiet ones alike, the reaching outward and the turning inward, all of it faded together as the darkness deepened. Their sleep grew worse in slow increments. The small warm feelings that make an ordinary day bearable thinned out, and then thinned further. Their effort to manage any of it drained away, not in one collapse, but as a steady matched withdrawal across the board. And then, as the sun finally climbed back over the edge of the world, and the season began to turn, all of it slowly returned. Smith gave the pattern a name that sounds almost tender for something so strange. He called it psychological hibernation. Stay with that word a moment, because it is close to the heart of everything tonight. A hibernating animal is not sick. It is not dying, and it is not giving up. It is doing something ancient and deliberate. It is lowering its own fire on purpose, dropping its heartbeat, banking its warmth, spending as little of itself as it possibly can, because the season it is trapped in cannot be argued with, and cannot be hurried. It can only be outlasted. And Smith's reading of what he saw was almost exactly that. He described psychological hibernation as a protective mechanism against long, grinding stress. When the conditions around you cannot be controlled, but you know, somewhere in you, that they are temporary, that spring is real even if you cannot feel it yet, the most efficient thing the mind can do is stop spending energy it does not need to spend. It stops trying to fix what cannot be fixed. It goes quiet, and it waits. This is the reversal that most people never see coming. We picture isolation breaking a person in some visible, dramatic way, a snapping, a coming apart you could point to. But the machinery underneath does something far more patient and far more unsettling. It protects you by dimming you. It keeps you alive across the long dark by making you a smaller, slower, less reactive version of yourself. And it does this so smoothly that from the inside it barely registers as loss. You do not feel yourself being turned down. You just find, week by week, that you are reaching for less, hoping for less, feeling less, and it all seems reasonable at the time. And here is the part that gives the whole thing its slow gravity. The hibernation feeds itself. It is not a single switch thrown once. It is a loop that tightens with every turn. Look at what the sealed Mars mission recorded. The crew of 6 men closed inside their habitat for 520 days. Their wrists tracked minute by minute across almost the entire run. As the months passed, the light they lived in grew dimmer. Not the sky, they had no sky, but the artificial light their own movement carried them through. In the first quarter of the mission, the crew moved through an average of just over 100 lux, which is already a thin, grey, indoor kind of light. Nothing like a real morning. By the final quarter that had fallen by more than a quarter, down toward the light of a single dull lamp in a closed room. And the reason it fell is the loop itself. The more sedentary they became, the less they moved through the brighter corners of the habitat, and the less light reached them, the more their inner clocks lost their footing, and the more their clocks drifted, the less reason their bodies had to get up and move. Stillness bred dimness, and dimness bred more stillness, each one quietly handing fuel to the other. You can watch the same withdrawal in the raw motion of their days. Across that mission, the crew's active, moving wakefulness fell by roughly 7%. On paper, 7% sounds like almost nothing, a rounding error, the kind of number you would skim past, but turned back into a human day, it is more than an hour of alertness, something close to an hour and 7 minutes, that their bodies simply stopped bothering to produce, every single day, without anyone deciding to be tired. And that hour did not vanish. It moved. Their time spent at rest, doing nothing, awake but idle, swelled by more than half again over where it had begun. Their sleep stretched a little longer too. The waking, working, reaching part of the day contracted, and the still, quiet, banked part of the day expanded to fill the space it left behind. The animal was lowering its fire, one small ember at a time, and the numbers on their wrists caught it doing so. Feel your way into what that would actually be like from inside your own skin, lying here as you are. Not a single dramatic morning where you cannot get up, just a slow softening of the reasons to. The tasks that once felt worth doing feel a fraction less worth doing. The hour you used to spend moving becomes an hour you spend sitting, and it does not feel like defeat, it feels like sense. Your appetite for the day recedes so gradually that you never catch the moment it changed. You are not sad exactly. You are not frightened. You are simply turned down, banked, conserving, running on a lower flame in a room the world has forgotten, and the terrible mercy of it is that it feels almost like peace. This is the mind protecting you the only way it knows how, against a length of time it cannot shorten, and the protection is real. It keeps people whole enough to walk out the far side when the sun comes back. But a fire banked too long, in a room sealed too tight, does something more than keep warm. It begins to separate. When 6 people all sink toward their own low private flame, on their own drifting inner clocks, in their own thinning pools of light, they stop banking together. The shared rhythm that once held them as one crew, waking together, eating together, moving through the same hours, starts to loosen thread by thread. Each of them is still surviving. Each of them is doing exactly what the mind was built to do. And yet the thing they made between them, the small sealed society keeping them human, is quietly beginning to lose its grip on itself. Somewhere past the middle of the long dark, The hibernation stops being something that happens inside each person alone and becomes something that happens between them, and that is where the ground starts to move. There is a place in the long dark where this slow curve stops bending and becomes something closer to an edge. Not a wall you walk into, not a door that slams behind you, an edge you cross without feeling the moment of crossing, so that only afterward, only in the data, can anyone lay a finger on it and say, here, this is where the floor tilted. The people who have given their careers to these sealed rooms have learnt exactly where to watch for it. It comes at around the 6th month, and it comes whether the crew is ready for it or not. Stay where you are for a moment. You have been lying here a little while now. Your body has already found the shape it will hold until the light comes back. Now let that stillness stretch. Imagine it is not the stillness of one evening, but the gathered stillness of half a year, and that everything gentle and slowing that is moving through you tonight has been moving through a handful of people in the same direction for 180 days without a single break in it. That is the threshold they arrive at, and the researchers who watched them arrive gave it a name with no drama in it at all. In a study published at the close of the year 2022, a team led by Jocelyn Dunn Rosenberg of Purdue University laid out what they had measured across the Mars analog missions on the volcano in Hawaii. The dome at 8,200 feet, where 6 people at a time lived sealed away with a 20-minute delay on every word they sent home. They had tracked the crews through the whole arc of confinement, month by month, in their hormones and their sleep, and the small daily record of how they moved and how they held together. And when they mapped it, it fell into 4 phases, like a tide going out in stages. The first phase was almost bright, the good stress of a new and demanding thing. The weeks when the novelty still carried its own small charge, and the mission felt achievable, and the crew moved through their days engaged and whole. The second phase was the quiet withdrawal, the deprivation, the reward chemistry beginning to thin, the 2 great mood molecules easing downward through the 3rd and 4th months. But it was the phases after that which mattered most, and it was the stretch running toward the 7th month that the researchers marked, in plain clinical language, as the most critical intervention point in a long-duration mission. Not the beginning, not the end, the middle. The place where if you were going to reach in and help someone, you would have to reach in right then, because that is where the structure starts to come apart. Watch what happens to the body first, because the body goes before the mind will admit that anything is wrong. On the volcano, the crew's physical activity did not taper gently the whole way through. It fell off a shelf, and it fell at the 6 and 7 month mark, the same window the researchers had already circled. And in the months just before it, the 5th and the 6th, something else reached its highest point. The slow chemical where a body gathers when it is stressed and still and starved of movement peaked precisely then, in the very weeks the crew had grown most motionless. Hold that overlap for a moment. The stillness climbs to its deepest point, and the invisible wear on the cells climbs with it, the 2 of them cresting together, in the same few weeks, in the same few people, in a room the size of a small apartment with no window to the world. Now set that against something you can feel in your own limbs tonight. 7%. That is how much of their waking, moving alertness the crews of one long confinement had quietly stopped producing by the far end. 7% sounds like almost nothing, a figure you would let slide past you. But turn it into the day you actually live, and it becomes 1 hour and 7 minutes. Every day, 1 hour and 7 minutes of alert, engaged wakefulness that the body simply stopped bothering to make, and did not decide to stop, and was not asked to stop, and let go of anyway. In its place, rest. The time spent doing nothing at all rose by more than half. The body was not resting because the work was finished. It was resting because, somewhere below the reach of any decision, it had begun to save itself for a siege it could not see the end of. And here the calm arithmetic turns strange, because the thing that comes apart at the 6th month is not any one person. It is time itself, the shared time. the single clock a crew has to keep between them if they are going to stay a crew at all. For this you have to go to the longest of all these experiments, the one in Moscow, the 520-day mission. 6 men sealed in a mock spacecraft for a year and 5 months to rehearse a journey to Mars that no one has yet taken. The scientists there gathered more of one particular kind of data than had ever been collected on people in confinement. Millions of minutes of it, a sensor on every wrist recording, almost without a gap, when each man slept and when each man woke. And buried in that mountain of quiet measurement was one person, recorded only as crew member B, whose inner clock did something that should frighten you more gently than almost anything else in this whole story. His day came loose from the day, left to itself, with no sun to set it, and no true morning to correct it. The human clock does not hold to 24 hours. It runs a little long, and his ran long enough to matter. His cycle of sleep and waking stretched to nearly 25 hours, 24 hours, and roughly 59 minutes on average. Some turns of it closer to 24 3/4 hours, some reaching just past 25. A free-running rhythm, the scientists called it. A clock with nothing outside it to pull it back into step. And a clock that runs an hour long each day does not simply run late. It walks. It drifts forward through the calendar, a little more each day, until the man carrying it is falling asleep as the others are waking, and waking as they settle down, and then, weeks on, sweeping back around into step for a while, and then out of it again. Now follow the consequence, because this is the moment the ground truly moves. If one man's clock runs an hour long, and another man's drifts along with it, then inside a single sealed room the size of a house there are no longer 6 people living in one day. There are 2 days. 2 overlapping schedules, sliding against each other, and when the researchers added it all up, they found that 2 of the 6 crew, the pair whose clocks had come loose, were asleep while the rest of the crew was awake, for a total of 2,498 hours across the mission. Let that number rest before you translate it, and then translate it, because it means almost nothing until you turn it into time you have lived. 2,498 hours is 104 days. 104 days. For more than 3 months of that mission, 2 of the 6 crewmen were, in every way that matters to a shared life, living in a different time zone than the people breathing the same recycled air a few feet away. Not on another continent, not on another ship, in the same sealed can, passing each other in a narrow corridor, one rising into a private morning as the other sank into a private night. And this was not one strange crew, one unlucky clock in one Russian facility. Back on the volcano in Hawaii, when the researchers there named their 4 phases, the last and deepest one they described by almost the same idea. Asynchronous coping, the point at which the crew's cycles of sleep and waking diverge, and the team stops moving as one body. 2 separate experiments on 2 different sides of the world, sealing away different people for different reasons, and both of them, at the far end, watched the same thing happen. The single shared day pulling apart into private drifting ones. When a pattern shows up that cleanly, in rooms that never spoke to one another, it stops being an accident of personality. It begins to look like something the mind simply does, given enough sealed time. You do not need to hold any of these numbers. They are not yours to carry tonight. Let them move through you the way the hours move through a sleeping crew, unmarked, uncounted, gone by morning. Let your shoulders give up a little more of their weight. The measurements will keep whether you remember them or not. There is one more figure from that Moscow mission worth resting on, because it measures neither the body nor the clock but the will. At the start, when the researchers asked the crew to rate their own workload, the effort they were putting into their days, the number came back at around 43 out of 100. By the later quarters, it had fallen to somewhere near 30, and it stayed there. They were not given less to do. The tasks did not shrink. What thinned was the willingness to meet them, the inner push that turns a task into an action. And the scientists have a word for this slow settling of a body into stillness and a mind into low effort. It is not laziness, and it is not despair. It is a person quietly deciding, without ever forming the decision, that less is enough now. And all of this, the loosening clocks, the falling activity, the thinning will, gathers toward a particular stretch of the journey that these researchers return to again and again. Not the beginning, where the danger seems obvious. Not the end, where relief is finally in sight. A place further along, past the middle, where the light at the finish is still too far to warm anyone, and the novelty is long spent, and the body has already banked itself low. There is a name for what waits there, and a shape to it that shows up mission after mission, in the ice and in the dome and in the sealed rooms of the analog. But to see it clearly, and to understand why it is the most dangerous stretch of the whole long dark, you have to follow these drifting, exhausted people a little further in. Researchers gave the thing a plain and almost gentle name. They call it the third quarter phenomenon, and the idea folded inside the name is simple, once you have heard it. Take any long confinement, any sealed and finite stretch of time, and divide it into 4 equal parts. The first quarter belongs to novelty. The second belongs to the settling in, the routine, the quiet slide we have already walked through together. But somewhere around the 3-quarter mark, around the place where 3 of every 4 days are already behind you, and only 1 in 4 still lies ahead, something turns. Not at the halfway point, where you might expect it. Later than that. In the stretch just past the middle, when the finish is close enough to think about, and still much too far to touch. It shows up as low mood, it shows up as low motivation, the will thinning further exactly when a crew can least afford to lose it. And it shows up, most reliably of all, as friction between people who until then had held together without effort. Small irritations that would have passed unnoticed in the first month suddenly turn sharp. Voices that had stayed even begin to catch on things, and the strange, almost unkind part of it is the timing. The danger does not peak when the situation is at its worst. It peaks when relief is finally faintly visible on the horizon, and the body understands that it still has to wait. The Mars 500 mission left one of the clearest records of this that we have. 6 men, sealed for 520 days, and every conflict between them noted down. The pattern surprised the people watching. The crew did not turn on each other the way the old stories about confinement always imagine. Conflicts between the crewmates were rare. Only 8 were logged across the entire 17 months, but conflicts between the crew and the world outside, the mission control team on the far side of the communication delay, were logged 41 times. More than 5 times as often. When the strain finally came, it did not travel sideways, between the men sharing those small rooms. It travelled outward, toward the distant voices who set the schedule, who could not be reached quickly, who could not be argued with in real time. And it did not fall evenly from everyone. Of all the conflict recorded across those months, 2 of the 6 men accounted for around 85% of it. 1 man alone generated just over half. Another generated roughly a third. The remaining 4, between them, barely registered at all. That unevenness runs through everything these studies found, and it may be the most important thing to hold gently tonight. Isolation does not do the same thing to every mind. In that same sealed Mars 500 crew, only 1 of the 6 men showed depressive symptoms that reached a level a clinician would call meaningful, and for him they were present in 93 of every 100 weeks of the mission. A low grey weather that almost never fully lifted, and yet 2 other men, in the very same habitat, breathing the same recycled air, living the very same 520 days, showed no measurable disturbance at all, no distress the instruments could find, from the first day to the last. You can let that sit for a moment. None of it is anything you need to carry. Let it pass through you, and move on. So if you were to ask which matters more, the length of the confinement or the person carrying it, the honest answer is that both do, and neither one predicts the other cleanly. Give the same duration to 2 people, and one may walk out untouched, while the other slowly darkens. But give enough duration to anyone, and the studies begin to converge on a single stretch of time where the odds tilt for almost everyone alike. In the Mars analogue on the volcano, the researchers marked it out precisely. The point just past the 6-month line, they wrote, was the most critical intervention moment in the whole mission. Not the beginning, not the physical hardship of the place, the stretch where the reward chemistry had already fallen, where the physical activity had already dropped away at the 6 and 7-month mark, where the oxidative wear inside the body was peaking, where the coping had already thinned, and where the crew's sleeping and waking rhythms had begun, quietly, to pull them apart from one another. Because by then, in more than one of these sealed worlds, the crew had stopped keeping the same time. Inside Mars 500, one man's internal clock stretched past 24 hours, running each day a little longer than the planet he had left behind, drifting forward through the calendar like a slow and steady tide. His cycle settled near 25 hours long, and he and one crewmate ended up asleep while the others were awake for 2,498 hours of the mission. That is 104 days. For more than 3 months, inside a single sealed habitat built for 6, 2 of the men were effectively living in a different time zone than the other 4, awake in the quiet while their crewmates slept, asleep while the others worked and ate and moved around them. And this is the layer that makes everything before it feels small. It is one thing for a single mind to grow tired and slow and low. It is another thing entirely for the shared clock of a crew, the one silent agreement that lets people occupy the same hours as each other, to come apart from the inside. The loosening we traced in one body was, all along, loosening the ties between bodies too. What waits in that third quarter is not only a person at their lowest, it is a small society beginning to fall out of step with itself, right at the moment it can least afford to. The disruption the researchers watched arrive was not one thing breaking. It was cohesion itself, the invisible fabric that had held the crew as a single unit, thinning strand by strand until the group was no longer quite one group. And that is the question these researchers could not stop circling back toward. If this is what the long dark does to a mood, and to a schedule, and to the fragile agreement that keeps a crew moving as one, then what, exactly, is being worn down underneath all of it? Not the temper, not the sleep timing, something older and more physical than either, sitting quietly beneath the behavior, beneath the arguments and the drifting clocks. Something in the tissue itself. To follow it any further, we have to stop watching what these people did, and look instead at what was happening inside the organ that was doing the listening all along. Inside the skull, in the dark, nothing announces itself. There is no pain when the change begins. That is the first thing to understand, and the strangest. Whatever was happening to these crews, in the sealed domes and the buried stations at the bottom of the world, it did not hurt. No one woke in the night holding their head. No one felt the tissue shift beneath them. And yet over the long months, something was shifting. Slowly, quietly, without any signal the mind could register, the organ doing the listening was beginning to rearrange itself. And not one of them could feel it happen. This is where the whole story turns, and where nearly everyone gets it wrong. When we imagine what solitude does to a person, we reach for old pictures. The castaway talking to a painted face, the prisoner scratching lines on a wall. We imagine that isolation is a kind of pressure, and that a person under pressure either holds or cracks. That the mind is a vessel, and the only 2 endings are the vessel endures or the vessel breaks. It is a comforting way to think about it, because it keeps the damage in the realm of the dramatic, the visible, the thing you would surely notice in yourself. You would know if you were losing your grip. You would feel the crack forming. But that is not what the measurements show. Not the crack. Not the collapse. Not the slow madness of the stories we tell. Something quieter, and in its own way far more unsettling. The mind does not shatter under long isolation. It does not, for most people, break at all. Instead, the physical brain, the actual living tissue folded inside the bone, grows measurably smaller. Not in a way anyone can feel, not in a way that shows on a face or in a voice, but in a way a scanner can see and count and put a number to. Let that sit for a moment. Before we go any further, you can let your shoulders drop as you hear it. None of this is a thing you need to hold on to. The point is only this: the harm of being sealed away from the world is not a story the mind tells about itself. It is a change in the substance the mind is made of. The clearest look we have at this comes from a study published in the year 2025, led by a researcher named David Rolfe, in a journal devoted to the biology of microgravity. His team followed 25 people who had lived and worked at Concordia Station, high on the Antarctic plateau, for roughly 12 months each. 20 of them were men, 5 were women. Their average age was a little over 37. Ordinary, capable, carefully selected adults, the kind of people trusted to run a research station in one of the most hostile places a human being can willingly go, where the mean temperature settles near -51 degrees Celsius, and the world outside offers nothing but ice in every direction. The researchers scanned their brains before they went. Then, after the long confinement, they scanned them again. And when they laid the 2 sets of images side by side, the pattern was not subtle to the instruments, even though it had been invisible to the people themselves. Grey matter had been lost. Not everywhere, not at random, but in specific named places. The temporal lobe, along the side of the brain. The parietal lobe, up toward the crown. The hippocampus, curled deep in the center, the small seahorse-shaped structure that lays down memory and helps you understand where your body sits in space. The pallidum, and the thalamus, buried at the very core. On top of all that, a reduction in the brain's global white matter, the wiring that lets one region speak to another. Region by region, the tissue had thinned, the organ had given up volume it had carried into the ice. And here is the detail that turns the stomach gently if you follow it. As the grey matter shrank, the empty spaces inside the brain grew to fill the room it left behind. Deep in every human head there are fluid-filled cavities, hollows called ventricles that the brain is built around. In these crew members, the lateral ventricles and the third ventricle enlarged over the course of the mission. The solid thinking tissue drew back, and the hollow spaces spread out into the vacancy. The brain had not only lost matter, it had, in a small and quiet way, become more hollow than it was before. Picture that as plainly as you can. Not a wound, not a bruise, nothing you could point to or feel, just a little more empty space where thinking tissue used to be, opening up over the months the way a house feels larger after the furniture is carried out. Nobody in that station reported it. Nobody could have. It was happening below every threshold the mind has for noticing itself. And it did not simply reset the moment they came home. The researchers went back a third time, 5 months after the crews had returned to the ordinary world, to green things and warm air and other faces. 5 months is a long time to recover, long enough for a broken bone to knit, and for the memory of the cold to soften, and still, at that follow-up, those enlarged ventricles remained significantly larger than they had been at the start. The brain, months after the isolation ended, had not yet finished closing the space back up. The dark had left a mark that outlasted the dark itself. So set aside the picture of the mind that snaps. It is not the right picture. The truth is not louder than that story. It is softer and slower and harder to comfort yourself against, because you cannot brace for a thing you were never built to feel. The damage of the long isolation was never in the drama, it was in the millimeters. Now, it would be easy to hear all of this and reach for the nearest reassurance, to decide it was a fluke. One station, one team, one unlucky reading of the scanner. The Antarctic plateau is an extreme place, after all, and 12 months is a long time, and perhaps something about that particular cohort, that particular cold, produced a result that would never repeat. That is the natural move the mind makes when it is handed something it does not want to hold. It looks for the exit. It looks for the reason this does not apply to anyone else, but the exit is not there. because this was not the first time a brain had been scanned before and after the long dark, and it was not the first time the tissue had come back changed. Years earlier, at a different Antarctic station, a station named Neumayer, another researcher had gone looking for the same thing. His name was Alexander Stahn, working across two great research institutions, one in Berlin and one in Pennsylvania, and his findings were published in 2019 in the New England Journal of Medicine, one of the most careful and demanding journals in all of medicine. His group was smaller, just 9 people, 5 men and 4 women, who spent 14 months at that station, with 9 of those months in total isolation, in a place where the temperature reached down to -50 degrees Celsius, and no help of any kind could arrive until the season turned. And when Stahn's team compared those 9 brains against people who had stayed behind in the ordinary world, they did not find a vague, diffuse shrinking. They found something precise. A single small structure had measurably grown smaller. It sits inside the hippocampus, the memory region we just named, and it is called the dentate gyrus. It is one of the most important pieces of tissue you carry, bound up in your ability to hold new memories and to reason about where things are in space. In the people who had endured the long isolation, that structure had shrunk compared to those who had not. 2 stations, 2 teams of researchers working years apart, with different people and different instruments and different lengths of confinement. And both of them, looking into the sealed human brain, found the same thing waiting there. Not nothing, not madness, loss. Real, physical, measurable loss, in the regions that hold who you are and how you move through the world. That is the turn we have been walking toward all this time. Everything in the earlier hours, the sliding mood, the drifting sleep, the crews falling out of step with one another, the slow erosion of the fabric that held them together, all of it had been the visible surface of something happening underneath. And underneath, it turns out, the brain itself was giving ground. The behavior was the shadow. This was the thing casting it. You can rest here for a breath, in the quiet of your own dark room, and know that your brain right now is doing none of this. You are not sealed away. Morning is coming. The world is still just outside the wall. Whatever these crews carried into the ice, you are not carrying it tonight. Let that be a small warmth to lie down into, because the story does not end at the fact of the loss. A shrinking brain is only the beginning of the question, not the answer to it. What does it actually feel like, from the inside, to lose a little of the tissue that holds your memory and your sense of place, when you cannot feel the loss at all? What happens to the person walking around inside a brain that is quietly thinning? And perhaps the most important question of all, the one that decides whether any of this is truly to be feared. When these people came home, when the sun came back and the doors finally opened, how much of what the dark had taken did they ever get back? That is where we go next. Deeper into the tissue, and deeper still into what it was doing to the mind that lived inside it. But before we step through that door, there is one thing about the shape of this loss that you should carry with you, because it is almost the reverse of what it appears to be. When most people imagine what happens to a mind sealed away from the world, they imagine weakness. They picture someone who was not strong enough, someone who could not cope, who let the walls close in, who lacked the discipline or the steadiness to hold themselves together. We tell ourselves that the people who come apart in the dark were always going to come apart, that there was some flaw in them waiting for the quiet to find it. It is a comforting story, because it lets the rest of us believe we would be fine. It is also wrong, not slightly wrong, wrong at the root. The people in these studies were not the fragile ones. They were the opposite. They were professional astronauts with years of training behind them. They were polar scientists and physicians and engineers, chosen precisely because they were steady, screened again and again for exactly the kind of resilience the rest of us only hope we have, and their brains changed anyway. The dentate gyrus, that small fold deep in the memory center of the brain, shrank in 9 of the most carefully selected people on the planet. It did not ask whether they were strong. It did not care how disciplined they were. The tissue thinned regardless. So this is not a story about weakness. It is a story about biology, not a failure of character, but a feature of the machine. The same brain that lets you love a person and find your way home in the dark and hold a number in your mind long enough to translate it, is also a brain that quietly rebuilds itself around the world it is given. Give it a world with no horizon, no seasons, no new faces, no distance to walk into, and it does what it has always done. It adapts to what is there by letting go of what is not. The shrinkage is not the brain breaking, it is the brain economizing. And that reframing matters, because it changes what you would do about it. If the loss were weakness, the answer would be to try harder, to grit your teeth, to want it more. But you cannot want your hippocampus back into shape. The answer, if there is one, lives somewhere much quieter, much closer to the thing you are doing right now. Here is the loophole. Here is the fragile hope threaded through all of this dread. When the researchers at Concordia looked at their 25 crew members, at whose brains had held their ground and whose had thinned the most, they did not find that it came down to willpower, or optimism, or personality. They found something almost tender in how ordinary it was. Better sleep was tied, again and again, to grey matter being preserved, not in some vague general way, but in the exact regions that isolation goes after. The temporal lobe, the parietal lobe, the hippocampus, the seat of memory itself. The people who slept well kept more of their brains, and the second thread was just as plain. Time spent moving the body, time in the small gym at the bottom of the world, showed a consistent link to brain volume being protected. Sit with that for a moment, because of where you are lying as you hear it. The two things that guarded the mind against the dark were not heroic. They were not rare gifts given to a lucky few. They were sleep and movement. Rest and the body. The most human, most animal things we have. The very act you are drifting toward right now, this slow surrender into sleep, is the same act that shielded the brains of people frozen into a continent for a year. So it is not that nothing can be done. It is that what can be done is almost embarrassingly gentle. Not a cure, not a machine, not a pill or a protocol. Just sleep, deep and regular. Just the body, kept in motion. The mind does not defend itself with force. It defends itself with rhythm. And yet, this is where the hope turns fragile in your hands, because the cruelty of isolation is precisely that it attacks the two things that would have saved you. Remember what Nathan Smith found in the Antarctic winter. Sleep quality did not hold steady. It progressively deteriorated, month after month, sliding downward through the dark until the sun came back to lift it. The shield made of sleep was thinning at the very moment the threat was growing. And the body. Remember the cruise in the volcanic dome, and the way physical activity fell away near the 6 and 7 month mark, in the same stretch of months when the oxidative damage was cresting. The second shield, movement, was being lowered just as the assault reached its height. This is the deeper dread underneath the fragile hope. Not that there is no defense, but that isolation is shaped, almost as if by design, to disarm you. It does not merely wound the brain, it quietly takes away the two tools you would have used to protect it, and it takes them slowly enough that you never notice them leaving your hands. You do not decide to sleep worse. You do not decide to move less. It happens to you, 1 degree at a time, and by the time the damage is deepest, the very things that could have held it back have already slipped away, which is why so much of what happened in these chambers happened without anyone feeling it happen. The brain that was thinning could not feel itself thin. The protein called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, the small molecular gardener that keeps nerve cells growing and alive, dropped within the first 3 months, and stayed low, still low a month and a half after the expedition was over, and no one inside that body felt the gardener set down its tools. There was no ache, no alarm, no moment where the mind announced, I am losing something. The loss was silent, and the defenses were silent as they fell, and the person walking around inside all of it simply felt, at most, a little more tired, a little less like themselves, a little less inclined to do the very things that would have helped. That is the turn, the thing that recontextualizes everything we have said so far tonight. The danger of 6 months in the dark was never that the mind would break in some loud, visible way. It is that the mind would quietly reorganize around a smaller world, shed a little of its own tissue to fit, and lower its own guard in the process, all of it below the threshold of feeling. The horror, if there is horror here, is not violence. It is efficiency. It is a system doing exactly what it was built to do, in the one situation where doing so slowly costs it pieces of itself. You are safe from all of that tonight. Your world has a horizon waiting in the morning. Your sleep is the shield, and you are lowering yourself into it on purpose. Let that be the thought you rest against before we go closer, because now the question narrows to the single life inside the changing brain. What it is actually like to be the person in there. What thins, and what holds, and what it feels like, from the inside, to lose a little of yourself and never once catch it in the act. From the inside, it does not announce itself. That is the part the numbers can never quite reach. A brain can shed measurable volume from its memory structures, its inner clock can slip its moorings, its chemistry can quiet by slow degrees, and the person living inside all of it can wake, and stretch, and go about the small business of the day, and feel more or less like themselves. Not transformed, not broken, just slightly unaccountably narrower, the way a familiar room feels smaller in the dark without your ever deciding that it shrank. The changes are real and they are physical, but the one instrument that cannot detect them is the very mind they are happening to. It is grading its own paper. It is the witness and the changed thing at once, and so the person keeps reporting that everything is fine, long after fine has quietly stopped being the honest word for it. Consider what the researchers found when they asked the isolated to improve. There is a thing that rested minds do without trying. When you test them over and over, they get better. You learn the shape of the test, you learn the trick of it, and your scores climb a little each time, not because you have grown smarter, but because practice wears a groove. Scientists call it the learning effect, and it is so ordinary, so dependable, that its absence becomes a signal all by itself. At the German station on the Antarctic ice, the participants whose memory structures had thinned the most showed the faintest version of that climb. The groove would not deepen. They took the test, and took it again, and their minds did not hold the earlier attempts the way an unburdened mind holds them. From the inside, that is not pain. It is not even frustration. Most days, it is simply the quiet failure of something to accumulate that should have accumulated. You would not feel it happening. You would only, much later, notice that you are standing more or less where you began. Now let the picture narrow to a single body and a single clock. One man, one of 6, sealed inside a windowless facility in Moscow for 520 days. Somewhere in the long middle of that confinement, time inside his own body began to come loose from the time on the wall. A human being kept without sunlight, without a fixed and enforced morning, tends to drift onto a clock slightly longer than the planet's own. His stretched to almost 25 hours. Not by much, by roughly an hour, day after day after day. But think about what an extra hour, quietly added to every single day, actually does. His personal mornings began to slide. Slowly, without any single moment you could point to, his waking crept later and later, all the way around the face of the clock and back again. He was not sick in any way he could feel snapping shut on him. He was rotating, like a man walking the wrong direction along a moving walkway so gently that he never once notices he is being carried backward through the calendar. This is the mathematics that everyday life keeps hidden from you. That same small drift lives inside all of us, every one of us lying here in the dark. But on Earth, the sun erases it at every dawn. Light comes through the window or under the door, and it resets the whole delicate machine before the era can build. Reset, reset, reset. One morning at a time, for your entire life, so faithfully that you have never had to know the drift was there. In the sealed chamber, nothing reset it. The tiny daily excess had nowhere to discharge, so it did what unspent things do. It gathered. 2 of the 6 men, kept in the same tin world, were asleep while the other 4 were awake for 2,498 hours. Translate that. It is 104 days. Better than 1/5 of the entire mission. For more than 3 months of shared confinement, 2 of the crew were effectively living in a different time zone than the 4 beside them, inside the very same walls, passing one another in a narrow corridor like commuters crossing on opposite shifts. Nobody had left. Everyone was present, and still the crew had quietly split into 2 little worlds, keeping 2 separate clocks, drifting apart inside a room they could cross in seconds. Rest with that image for a moment. You do not need to carry it anywhere. Let your own clock stay exactly where it is, anchored to the morning that is genuinely coming for you, and let your breathing lengthen while we go one step colder, because here is where the dread lifts to its highest altitude, and it is not in anything that happened. It is in what was always missing from these studies, quietly, in the fine print. The Antarctic winter, however brutal, ends. The sun returns. The mind that throttled itself down for the dark wakes back up when the light comes over the ice. Every experiment you have heard about tonight, the thinning brain, the sliding chemistry, the drifting clock, the hibernating spirit, every single one was measured inside a confinement that had an end date the participants could count down toward. There was always a morning at the far edge of it. Now take the end date away. The missions being planned in real earnest, the long voyages outward, do not last a single winter. They last years. Years with no horizon waiting in the morning, no season turning over, no rescue written anywhere into the calendar. And the one factor a researcher named Nathan Smith identified as the thing that makes the mind's hibernation survivable, that the hardship is temporary, and crucially, known by the sufferer to be temporary, is the exact thing a true voyage into deep space cannot promise anyone aboard. The mind will conserve itself for a darkness it believes will end. What it does when the darkness has no believed ending, no one has yet had to find out. And there is a cruel geometry in when the damage would land. The researchers who studied the astronaut who spent nearly a year above the Earth found that his cognitive decline did not arrive in the quiet middle of the mission. It struck on the way home. He was slower and less accurate on almost all of the 10 tests he was given after landing, and the effect lingered for 6 months on the ground. The scientist who ran those tests called it a possible red flag, and said the plain unsettling thing underneath it, that in the business of spaceflight, tiny mistakes can turn into catastrophic ones. The mind is at its most worn precisely when the stakes climb highest, at the descent, at the landing, at the moment everything has to be done right. The valley of the drift lines up exactly with the peak of the danger, but then the data does something that refuses to settle into any clean, portable rule, and this is the strangest mercy and the strangest terror folded into the same fact. It does not happen to everyone the same way. Of the 6 men sealed in Moscow, one, the one recorded only as E, carried depressive symptoms through 93% of the mission weeks. Nearly the whole long voyage lived out under a low-grey ceiling, and 2 others, recorded as C and D, went the entire 17 months with no measurable disturbance at all. Same walls, same recycled air, same food, same starless windows, same slow drift of the shared clock. One mind sank early and stayed down. 2 others walked through the whole of it untouched, or near enough to untouched that the instruments, watching closely, could find nothing to report. You cannot know in advance which of them you would be. There is no test waiting at the gate that sorts the durable from the fragile. The same confinement is a survivable season for one person, and a long grey drowning for another, and the only way to learn your own answer is to go in and live it. Even the friction, when it finally came, did not point where you would expect. You might imagine 6 people locked together for a year and a half turning on each other, wearing grooves of resentment into the person across the table. That is not mostly what happened. The conflicts logged with the distant mission controllers outnumbered the conflicts between crewmates by better than 5 to 1, 41 against only 8. The people you are sealed with become almost sacred, the only living warmth in the metal, and so the strain gets exported, sent down the radio link to the faceless voices who are not in the room, who cannot be seen, who carry none of the weight. And even that friction was not evenly shared. 2 of the 6 men accounted for roughly 85% of all of it. One mind aimed its exhaustion outward. Another mind, in the same box, simply did not. And beneath every one of these, quiet as a tide going out, the will itself was ebbing. When the Moscow crew rated how hard they were working, the number fell from around 43 out of 100 in the first quarter to somewhere near 30 in the ones that followed. They did not have less to do. The world had not lightened its demands on them. What thinned was the drive to meet those demands, the initiative, the ordinary spark that gets a body up and moving toward a task. The monotony and the confinement worked on their motivation the way water works on stone, and the person inside felt, at most, a little less like bothering today than yesterday, and less again the day after that. So the question that remains, the one this whole long descent has been circling toward, is not whether the mind changes. We have watched it change, structure by structure and hour by hour. The question is, what it is actually like to be the one it is happening to, and which parts of a self stay standing when so much else is quietly giving way. To be the one it is happening to is, strangely, to feel almost nothing at all. That is the part the numbers can never show you, lying here in the dark. The brain does not ache as it gives back its volume. The hippocampus sends up no alarm when its cells grow thin. The widening spaces inside the skull do not press on anything you could name or point to. From the inside, on the day it is happening, you would most likely feel fine. A little duller perhaps, a little slower to reach for a word, a little less inclined to begin the thing you had meant to begin. Nothing you could not explain away as tiredness, as a long week, as the ordinary weight of being far from everything you love. This is what makes the newest of these studies so quietly unsettling. In 2024, researchers followed 25 professional astronauts through 6-month missions aboard the space station, and when they looked at the group as a whole, they found no systematic decline. As a crowd, the astronauts held. Their average scores stayed level. If you stopped there, you would call it good news, and you could go to sleep reassured. But an average is a kind of mercy, and what it is merciful about is the individual. When the researchers looked closer, they saw that on tests of visual working memory, nearly 19 scores out of every 100 had fallen to a place well below where that same person had started. On processing speed, almost 17 out of 100. On sustained attention, close to 14. The group was fine. Particular people quietly were not. And no one in that group, least of all the person slipping, would necessarily have known which was which. The same truth had already surfaced, years before, in the sealed chamber in Moscow. Of the 6 men closed in for 520 days, one carried the weight of it hardest, showing signs of low depressed mood across the great majority of the mission's weeks. And yet 2 of those same 6, breathing the same recycled air, watching the same unchanging walls, moved through the entire 17 months, with no measurable disturbance at all, no distress the instruments could catch, no fraying anyone could see. Same room, same duration, same deprivation, utterly different fates inside, which tells you something the averages never will. The isolation does not do one thing to the human mind. It does whatever that particular mind is most quietly prone to. It finds the seam in each person separately, and no one who steps aboard can be told in advance which kind of person they will turn out to be. So gather it now, all of it, the way it actually arrives, which is never one thing at a time. It is not only the reward chemistry sliding lower, month after month. It is not only the structures of the brain surrendering their volume to the empty spaces around them. It is not only the internal clock stretching until it no longer keeps step with the people in the next room. It is not only the will to move thinning like a tide drawing out. It is all of these together in the same body across the same 6 months, each one feeding the next. Move less, and the light you take in falls. Take in less light, and the clock drifts further. Let the clock drift, and sleep begins to fray. Let sleep fray, and the very thing these studies found most protective of the brain, a good and steady night's rest, is the first thing you lose. Every negative leans on the one beside it. Nothing here fails alone, and here is the arithmetic that everyday life is kind enough to keep hidden from you. A change so small you would never feel it on any single day does not stay small. It compounds. A body that surrenders a little more than an hour of its daily wakefulness is not losing an hour. It is losing that hour again tomorrow, and again the day after that, until the hours stack into days, and the days into weeks, of a self that simply was not switched on. A clock that runs a few minutes long each night does not run a few minutes long by the end. The minutes gather, quietly, night after night, until a person is awake in the dark while everyone they know is sleeping, and sleeping through the light while everyone else is alive. Nothing in the moment ever feels like a catastrophe. The catastrophe is only visible from a distance, when you finally add it all together, and by then it has already happened. Now stretch the frame wider than any of these rooms, wider than a single Antarctic winter or a single simulated year, out toward the thing all of this was really built to ask. Because every chamber we have walked through tonight, the frozen stations at the bottom of the world, the dome on the side of the volcano, the windowless facility in Moscow, holds a human being for roughly the length of the journey out to Mars, and no longer. Not the round trip, not the years away, only the going. And we hold a single precious measurement of what a full year up there does to one particular mind. In 2015, the astronaut Scott Kelly spent 340 days aboard the space station, while his identical twin brother Mark stayed on the ground. The same genes, the same face, one in orbit, one at home, so that whatever changed in the one who left could be measured against the one who did not. And the strangest finding was not that Scott declined, it was Wynne. Through his first 6 months up there, and through his second, his mind held remarkably steady. There was no clear difference between the two halves of his year away. The reckoning waited until he came home. Back on Earth, tested against himself and against his brother, he was slower and less accurate on almost every one of 10 cognitive tasks, and he stayed that way for 6 long months after his feet had touched the ground. Sit with the cruelty of that timing, gently, because it is the sharpest edge in everything we have counted. The mind does not falter in the quiet middle, where a mistake would cost you little. It holds through the long emptiness, and then it slips at the return, at the descent, at the very moment a person is doing the most delicate and dangerous work of the entire voyage. The scientist who ran those tests called it a red flag, and he chose his words plainly. In work like that, he said, tiny mistakes can turn into catastrophic ones. Half a second slower to read a dial, a fraction less certain in a single choice. On the ground it is nothing at all. Coming down through the thin air onto another world, with the whole crew's lives resting on your dimmed and slowed attention, it is everything. None of this is yours to carry tonight. You are not going to Mars. Your clock is keeping faithful time with the world just outside your window, and the morning will find you exactly where it always does. Let the weight of it pass straight through you and out into the dark. But hold, just as you drift, this one quiet thing, because it is where the last of our journey begins. Everything we have counted so far has been a loss you could measure. A volume, a percentage, an hour, a score. What we have not yet asked is the harder question lying underneath all of them. When the chemistry dims, and the structures thin, and the clock lets go, and the will falls silent, what is left of the person in the middle of it? What, exactly, is the self that endures? No instrument ever built can weigh a self. There is no scan that shows you the person, no single number that holds the part of you that stayed awake through all of it, quietly watching from behind your own eyes. And yet the people who study these sealed rooms found something close to the next best thing they could do. They waited. They let the crews come home. They let the doors open and the light come back and the ordinary world close around them again. And then, months later, they measured what had returned and what had not. Because a self, whatever it turns out to be, leaves a trail in the tissue. And if you want to know what endures, you can begin by watching, very carefully, what heals. So here is the gentle part first, the part you are allowed to hold as your breathing slows. Most of it comes back. When David Rolfe and his colleagues followed their 25 Concordia crew members home and scanned their brains again, 5 months after the ice had finally released them, they found that the organ had begun to refill the spaces it had emptied. The temporal lobe, which had thinned across roughly a year in the cold, had returned to where it started. The parietal lobe had come back. And the hippocampus, that small curled structure deep in the middle of things that files each passing day into memory, the very region everyone had worried about most, had quietly returned to its baseline. The pallidum, buried in the core, had recovered as well. 4 of the 5 places that had shrunk across nearly 12 months of isolation had, given only a season of ordinary living, filled back in. Let that settle for a moment, because it is a kind of mercy, and mercies are rare in this particular story. The brain is not a wax seal that takes a permanent impression. It is closer to something living and hungry, something that starts rebuilding the instant you give it back the things it was starved of. Sunlight, movement, faces, the small, unremarkable friction of a world that does not stay the same from one hour to the next. Give it those things again, and it reaches for them. It thickens. It comes back toward the shape it had before you ever left. If you had lain in that Antarctic dark for a year, and someone had shown you the scan of your own thinned brain and told you it was ruined, they would have been wrong. It was not ruined. It was waiting. But you already know, because I told you at the very beginning of tonight, that not all of it came back. And now we arrive at the one place that did not. Of all the regions that had lost their grey matter across that long confinement, only one was still measurably diminished 5 months after the crew came home. It was the thalamus. And of everything we have counted tonight, this is perhaps the quietest and the strangest thing to sit with. The thalamus is not a place most people have ever heard of. It sits deep, almost exactly at the centre of the brain. 2 small egg-shaped bodies nested near the middle of your skull. And nearly everything passes through it. Almost every signal your senses gather, the light and the sound and the touch and the ache, is routed up through the thalamus, on its way to becoming something you are aware of. It is less a room than a doorway. It is the threshold that the outside world crosses to become your inner one. And after roughly 12 months sealed away from that world, it was the one part that had not yet found its way home. You do not need to be alarmed by this. Nobody is saying those men and women were harmed in any way they could feel walking down a street. 5 months is not the end of the healing. It is only where the researchers happened to look. One more window in a longer recovery that was likely still going on. But there is something worth holding gently in the fact that the last structure to recover was the gateway itself. As though of everything the isolation touched, the deepest mark was left on the very threshold where the world becomes you, the place that decides what gets through. It thinned, out there in the quiet, and it was slow, so slow, to open all the way back up. And it was not alone in outlasting the isolation that caused it. Remember the protein, the one called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, the small molecule whose whole job is to help nerve cells grow and to keep them alive. Alexander Stahn and his team had watched it fall in their Antarctic crew at Neumayer Station, within just 3 months of the doors closing. What they found afterward is the part that stays with you. 1.5 months after the expedition had ended, after these people had returned to the ordinary warm world, their levels of that protein had still not climbed back to where they had been before they left. The thing the isolation switched down did not simply switch back on the moment the isolation stopped. The body kept running low on the very substance it uses to tend and repair itself, weeks after the reason for it was gone. The confinement, in a sense, followed them home. It let go of the calendar long before it let go of the chemistry. This is the shape of the answer then, as far as any of these studies can give one. The self endures, but it endures the way a coastline endures a long winter of storms. Most of the shape is still there in the spring, the water pulled back, and there is one small cove, one particular threshold, where the line of the land now sits a little differently than it did, and will take its own slow time to return, if it fully returns at all. Now let your shoulders drop, because I am about to tell you the part of all this that is, strangely, the most hopeful thing in the entire night, and you should be soft when you hear it. Not everyone was marked the same way, not even close. This is the finding that quietly refuses to let the whole story become a single grim line pointing downward. Because when the researchers looked, person by person, at the 6 men who spent 520 days sealed inside the Mars 500 facility in Moscow, what they found was not one shared decline. It was 6 different fates. One man, the one they labelled only with the letter E, so as never to name him, carried something close to depression through 93% of the mission weeks. Almost the entire way. Week after week after week, low and heavy, for the better part of 17 months. And yet 2 other men in that same sealed habitat, breathing the same recycled air, eating the same food, seeing the same 5 faces every single day for the same 520 days, showed no measurable disturbance at all, no behavioral trouble, no psychological distress the instruments could find. 2 of them walked the whole length of it, from the closing of the door to the opening of it a 1.5 years later, and came through as steady as they went in. Sit with how remarkable that is. Same room, same dark, same monotony grinding down the same number of days. And the isolation reached one man almost completely and barely touched 2 others. Whatever the self is, it is not a uniform material that fails at a fixed load. It is something that varies, deeply and stubbornly, from one person to the next. Some part of what carries you through a thing like that is written into who you already are before you ever begin. And no scan, no biomarker, no wrist-worn tracker collecting its millions of minutes has ever fully explained why. The mind, at the last measurement, keeps a little of itself back from the counting. And there is one more thread here, and this is the one I want you to carry down into sleep tonight, because it is small, and it is quiet, and it is unlike almost everything else we have counted, something a person can actually reach for. When Rolf's team went back through all their data, looking for anything that had protected the brains that were protected, 2 things rose to the surface, plainly and consistently. The first was sleep. Better sleep, across that long confinement, was tied again and again to grey matter that held its ground. The temporal lobe, the parietal lobe, the hippocampus. The people who slept well kept more of themselves. And the second thing was movement. The simple use of the small gym inside that frozen station. That too, over and over, lined up with brains that preserved their volume through the dark. There is something almost tender in that, if you let yourself feel it. Of all the forces we have watched work against these minds tonight, the dimming chemistry and the drifting clocks and the slow erosion of the will, 2 of the strongest things standing on the other side, quietly holding the line, were rest and gentle motion. The most ancient defenses there are. The body did not need a miracle to protect itself. It needed sleep, and it needed to move, and where it had those, it kept more of what it was. You are, right now, doing one of those two things. You are lying still, letting the day empty out of you, letting the count of all these losses drift past without holding on to a single one. There is nothing here you need to remember. The names will fade by morning, and that is exactly as it should be. But underneath the tenderness, underneath the sleep and the movement and the four regions that healed, there is still that one small deep place that did not come back on schedule, and the protein that stayed low after everyone had gone home, and the two quiet men who were untouched while a third was slowly hollowed. Recovery and residue, sitting side by side, refusing to cancel each other out. And that leaves us at the very edge of tonight with the one question none of these instruments were ever built to answer. And yet the instruments were not finished with us. There is one more layer underneath all the others, one last set of measurements, and it does not come from the ice, and it does not come from the sealed rooms bolted to the ground. It comes from the only real isolation human beings have actually lived through, out past the top of the air, going around and around the Earth in the dark. 25 astronauts, most of them somewhere in their mid-40s, close to a third of them women, tested again and again across 6-month stays aboard the station. And here, for a moment, the story turns almost kind. Taken as a group, there was no decline, no slow, obvious erosion you could point to and say, there, that is what half a year does to all of us. On average, these were people who stayed sharp. The number held. If you looked only at the group, you would close the folder and call it good news. But the average is a kind of mercy, and mercy hides the individual. Look closer, at single people on single tests, and the smooth surface begins to fray. Nearly 1 in 5 of the visual working memory scores fell at or below a point a full step and a half beneath that person's own baseline. Low enough that before the mission, it would have been strange for them. Roughly 1 in 6 of the processing speed scores did the same, closer to 1 in 7 for sustained attention. The plain, unglamorous ability to keep watching, to keep noticing, to not let the mind slide off the task. These were not clumsy people. They were among the most tested minds on the planet. These were only moments, scattered days, when a specific mind simply worked worse than it had ever worked before it left the ground. And it was slowest early, when the strangeness was still fresh. Processing slower, memory slower, attention slower. Most of it eased as the body learned the new world, the way you settle into any room once its shape stops surprising you. But one of those measures, the one that asks you to hold something in mind and turn it over at the same time, stayed slow even after the astronaut came home. The mission ended. The slowness did not. Which brings us to the strangest finding of the entire night, and the one that should quietly trouble anyone who dreams of sending people to Mars. There was a man who spent 340 days in orbit, most of a year, while his identical twin brother stayed here on the ground, breathing ordinary air, sleeping in an ordinary bed. A living copy of him, held still, so the difference could be measured. And while he was up there, month after month, the tests found no great gap between his first 6 months and his second. The mind seemed to hold its level. Whatever it was costing him, it did not keep costing more the longer he stayed. You could take that as comfort, the body finding its floor and standing on it, and then he came home. And on almost all 10 of the cognitive tests they gave him, he was slower, and he was less accurate, and it lasted for 6 months after his feet were back on solid Earth. The scientist who ran those tests said the thing out loud that everyone already felt in the quiet of the room, that this was a red flag, that the most dangerous stretch of a long journey might not be the endless middle at all, but the return, the descent, the landing, the exact moment a small mistake stops being small. Picture it gently. Half a year, longer, of the mind reshaping itself in the dark, and the bill for all of it arriving late, at the one moment you most need to be perfect. Not during the endurance. After it, on the way down. This is the layer that ties the whole night together, the single thread running through every sealed place we have wandered into. The stations on the ice told us the brain changes its shape. The chamber in Moscow told us the body drifts loose from shared time. The dome on the volcano told us the chemistry of reward runs quietly dry somewhere past the 6th month. And now the orbit tells us that all of it can hide inside a perfectly ordinary-looking average, patient, and can arrive after the danger seems to have already passed. And yet, run your hand back across everything, and the hope has not left the room. It is only smaller than we wanted it to be, and softer. Most people, most of the time, come through. In that Moscow chamber, 2 men went the whole 520 days with nothing worth recording. No disturbance, no distress, nothing to measure, while a 3rd man beside them was slowly hollowed. The same walls, the same dark, the same length of time laid over all 3 of them like a single blanket. And that time did one thing to one man and almost nothing to another, and no instrument we have ever built can tell you, in advance, which of them you would turn out to be. So we are left holding 2 true things at once, and they will not fold into one, no matter how we turn them in the dark. The brain heals. The brain keeps a scar. The mind endures. The mind is quietly, permanently a little changed. The isolation ends, and something of it stays low, and stays deep, and stays. You do not have to reconcile any of that tonight. You are not the astronaut. You are not the man in the chamber. You are only lying here in the safe dark, letting these findings drift over you like weather off a far coast. None of them yours to carry. None of them asking anything of you at all. Let your shoulders go. Let the numbers pass. But there is a place where all this careful counting finally runs out. Every study we have walked through measured something you can write down. Grey matter in cubic millimeters. Hours awake. Lux of light falling on a face. A protein in the blood. A score on a test. And for 6 months of a life sealed away from every other person, that counting tells us an enormous amount. And it tells us almost nothing. Because the one thing none of these machines was ever built to weigh is what it is actually like, from the inside, to be the person the numbers are describing. What it feels like to be a mind alone with itself for that long, whether something is lost in there that no scan will ever locate. That is the edge we have finally reached. And that is where we are going next. So stay with me at that edge for a little while, gently, the way you might stand at the mouth of a cave you have no intention of entering tonight. Everything behind us in this long night was measurable. Everything past this line is not. And it would be easy to treat that as a failure, as a gap the science simply has not closed yet. It is not a gap. It is a different country. A brain scan can tell you that the hippocampus grew smaller, and then, for most people, grew back. It cannot tell you what a single memory felt like while that was happening. A monitor on a wrist can count the hours a person lay still. It cannot count what moved through them while they lay there. The numbers were never lying to us. They were only ever describing the outside of something whose inside stays sealed. Even from the instruments, even from us, sometimes even from the person living inside it. And so we arrive, at the end, at the questions the machines were never built to answer. Perhaps the mind that comes home from 6 months alone is the same mind that left, only tired, only briefly rearranged, settling back into its familiar shape the way a room settles once you have finally opened the windows. Or perhaps something small stays behind in there, some quiet, unnamed adjustment, a faint new distance between a person and the world, so subtle that no test would catch it, and no friend would ever quite put a name to it. Or perhaps what we have been calling damage all this time was never damage at all. Perhaps it was competence. Perhaps the shrinking, the slow chemical quieting, the coping strategies that fell away when there was nothing left worth coping against. All of it was the mind, doing exactly what a mind is built to do when it is asked to hold still inside a small, cold, unchanging place for longer than anything in its history ever prepared it for. Not breaking, not enduring untouched, something wiser and stranger than either, folding itself down to fit the duration, and trusting, quietly, that it would be able to open again. You do not have to decide which of those is true tonight. No one has decided it yet. The people who have given their careers to this stand at exactly the edge you are standing at now, holding the same open, empty hands. So let your hands stay open too. Let the not knowing be a soft thing rather than a sharp one. There is nothing here you are required to solve before you sleep. Nothing to resolve, nothing to carry down into the dark with you. The question can stay out here on the frontier where it belongs, glinting, patient, unhurried, while you go on ahead without it. Remember too, that the mind was never one single thing responding one single way. Of the 6 who lived through those 520 days in the sealed module, 2 moved through the entire confinement with no measurable disturbance at all, calm the whole way down, as if the walls had simply agreed not to touch them. And one of the 6 struggled through very nearly every week of it, the low mood arriving and staying. Same room, same duration, same cold arithmetic of the days. And still the mind that met it was different in each of them, so different that no single verdict could ever cover all 6. Which is its own quiet argument for humility. If we cannot even say what the isolation does, only what it did to these particular people, in this particular order, then the interior stays exactly as private as it has always been. Yours included. Especially yours. And there is something else worth setting down beside you before the light goes all the way out. None of this is a prophecy about you. You are not being told what the dark does to a person. You were never one of the 25 at the bottom of the world, one of the 9 at the edge of the ice, one of the 6 sealed inside a windowless room in a quiet corner of Moscow for a year and a half, choosing that confinement on purpose, for the rest of us, so that these things could finally be known. What happened to them happened at the far, thin edge of what a human being can be asked to withstand. Your isolation, whatever measure of it you may feel tonight, is not that isolation. Your quiet room, with its door that opens, with its morning already on its way toward you, with the voices you could reach in a moment if you wanted them, is not a chamber at the bottom of a frozen continent. The findings are theirs. The frontier is theirs. You are only borrowing it for an hour, from a warm and ordinary distance, on your slow way down into sleep. Because here is the thing this whole long ladder of a night was quietly climbing toward, underneath all the shrinking and the sliding and the drift. They came home, every one of them, the crew who wintered where the air falls to 51 degrees below zero, and lower still, colder than almost anywhere a person has willingly gone. The 9 who watched their own memory and their own attention dim, and then, with a steadiness that is hard to imagine, sat down and measured that dimming in themselves. The 6 who lived a year and a half in a room that never once, in all that time, showed them the sky. They walked back out into the world, and when the researchers looked at their brains again, months later, most of what had changed had quietly changed back. The temporal lobe, the parietal lobe, the hippocampus, that small deep seat of memory that had given up some of its volume to the cold, all of it drawn back toward where it began, as though the body had only ever been lending the isolation something, and had meant all along to take it back. Not quite all of it, we know that too. One small structure kept its new shape a while longer, still faintly altered 5 months after the person had come home, as if it were simply in less of a hurry than the rest of the brain to forget where it had been. But even that is not a wound. It is closer to a record. It is the mind keeping, for a season, a faint impression of the place it survived, the way you might keep a stone in a pocket long after you have left the shore you found it on. And the things that protected all of them, the things that stood between a person and the slow erosion of the cold, turned out to be the plainest, oldest things there are. Sleep. Movement. The ones who slept better kept more of themselves intact. The ones who kept their bodies moving kept more of their brains. Not medicine, not some intervention flown in from far away. Rest and motion. The 2 simplest instructions a body has ever given itself. standing quietly guard at the door. And you are already doing one of them, lying here in the dark, letting the whole weight of the day go loose across the mattress, letting your breath find its own slower rhythm. You are giving your own mind the exact thing that guarded theirs at the bottom of the world. There is nothing you need to add to that, nothing to improve, nothing to get right. The protection is not a technique. It is this. It is the thing you are already, without effort, doing. So let your shoulders come down from wherever the day left them. Let your jaw unclench. Let the hands rest wherever they have fallen. The single most powerful thing anyone in any of these studies could do to hold themselves together, you are already halfway inside of. Let the numbers we gathered along the way loosen their grip as they go, the cubic millimeters, the lux of light on a face, the percentages of a mission spent asleep while the others were awake. They were only ever a way of reaching towards something that will not fully be reached, a way of pressing our instruments up against the outside of an experience and reading what little bled through the glass. They served us honestly, and now they can be set down. You will not need to remember a single one of them. They were never yours to keep. And what stays, when all the counting has quietly emptied out of the room, is not a number at all. It is something closer to wonder, if you let it be, that a mind can be taken to the coldest, emptiest, most sealed-off places a body can be carried to, held there past the point where its own chemistry begins to dim, past the point where its own architecture begins to give a little ground, and still, when the door finally opens, walk back out into the light, and slowly, patiently, become itself again. That is not the story of a fragile thing. It never was. It only looked that way when we were down close, watching the small parts fail one by one. Step back, and the shape of it changes entirely. So let yourself step back now. Let the whole of it lift up and away from you, off the small warm island of this bed, up past the walls of this room, up into the wide, unhurried dark that has been waiting above all of it the entire time. That is where the last of the questions want to go. Not answered, not put to rest, just released, gently, into the one place large enough to hold them, where the counting ends and something far older and far quieter begins to take its place. Perhaps that is the truth of it. Perhaps the mind was never meant to be sealed away from the world, and every day of those long confinements was a slow subtraction it could only ever partly undo. Or perhaps the opposite lies nearer the mark. Perhaps the shrinking, and the throttling down, and the quiet chemistry going dim were never damage at all. Only a living thing doing exactly what living things do when the world around them grows small and cold and still. Folding inward, spending less. Waiting for the light to come back. Or perhaps, and this is the one that stays, it is both of those at once, and we simply do not yet have instruments fine enough to tell the wound from the wisdom apart. There is a room in this that no one has finished measuring. 5 months after those crews came home, almost everything had returned. The memory center. The regions that hold your quiet sense of where you are in a space. They filled back in, softly, the way a field greens again after a hard winter. Only one small structure, deep in the middle of the head, had not. And no one can yet tell you whether it was still on its slow way back, patient, unhurried, or whether it had settled into something that stays. The study that would answer that has not been run. The person who will one day run it may not even be born. So here is what is yours to keep. You are not one of those crews. You are not sealed beneath an Antarctic winter, or drifting inside a habitat where the light thins quarter by quarter until the dark seems to seep in from the walls. You have this room, and the ordinary air of it, and a door that opens the moment you choose. The two things those studies found protected the brain the most, the good sleep and the gentle movement of a body through its day, are not rare instruments locked inside a research station at the bottom of the world. They are already yours. You were reaching for one of them the moment you lay down tonight. And step back far enough, and even the confinement stops looking like confinement. Every one of us is sealed inside something. A skull, a body, A single small world, turning in the dark, months and years and lifetimes from the nearest other shore. We are all of us on the long mission, every one of us learning, without ever once being taught, how to hold a mind steady across a distance it was never built to cross. Those crews only did it out where we could finally watch. They lived in plain sight, the thing the rest of us are quietly doing all the time. That is not a heavy thing to carry down into sleep. It is very close to the opposite. What all those numbers finally gather into is not fragility, but a strange, stubborn resilience. An organ that can be starved of light and company and time itself, can lose a little of its own substance in the losing, can hibernate and dim, and drift out of step with everyone around it, and still, when the door swings open, find its slow way back to whole. You are made of exactly that. It is working in you right now, in the dark, asking nothing at all of you. Let it work. Let the last of the questions rise off you and go where they were always going, up past the ceiling, up into the wide and ancient quiet that never once needed you to solve it. So let the counting go, and let the dark keep it, for the mind that travelled so far is finally, safely, home.